Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So thanks again, everyone, for being here, um, for this talk, for this retreat, for this session together. Tonight, I figured I'd share a little bit about karuna, compassion. Yesterday, we spoke a little bit about metta and shared how we've sort of each been approaching or grappling with this idea of friendliness or loving kindness, especially in the context of our lives as queer people, as friends to queer people, as people trying to understand more deeply what it means to inhabit a queer body and to interact in the world as someone who, maybe more often than we would like, stands apart from the people around us. And so I had mentioned yesterday that these four qualities, these four Brahma Viharas, metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, have been particularly useful for me as a queer person in not just developing my practice, but also in recognizing certain parts of my life that previously, without the practice or without a sort of guiding compass, were too painful to look at. Or if I looked at them, it'd be like, well, what do I do with that now? What do I do with these uncomfortable feelings? What do I do with this fear, anger, resentment, sadness, and grief? So I found the Brahma Viharas, all of them really particularly useful for at least being a lens through which to reflect on my experience. Usually those experiences were not so pleasant, not so welcome, not so positive, but even the positive ones have been useful to look at through this lens of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So loving kindness, metta, gets a lot of press in Buddhist circles. Most people, it's actually probably one of the first things they learn how to develop or at least start to use in daily life, as well as in meditation or on cushion. Then I would say compassion comes next, but it's a very far second. So I think in terms of perhaps popularity, you'll hear mostly about loving kindness and equanimity. Compassion, depending on the circles you move in, and joy come up maybe as byproducts, but not so much as specific things to cultivate, at least through my experience. But I found that compassion in particular has been one of the most powerful of the Brahma Viharas, especially in dealing with and looking at and trying to understand some of the experiences that I've had in my life, understanding them in order to process them, but also understanding them so as to be able to let them go. And I'll say a little bit shortly about what I mean by that. But before, this aspect of compassion, just as we did in the meditation, is something that we don't just offer to other people, we also offer it to ourselves. And I say that in that way because I found that, particularly in perhaps American circles, we tend to forget about this being right here. And even more so in BIPOC circles, we can forget about this being right here. And even more so in queer circles, we can forget about this being right here. This idea that maybe we aren't as deserving as others of happiness, as deserving as others of peace, of compassion, of kindness, and of caring. And the reasons for that are numerous. I think maybe all of us could point to moments in our lives where we felt or experienced inattention, uncaring, even perhaps violence and abuse. And it's sad, but expected that those things would lodge themselves somewhere in our hearts, somewhere in our minds, somewhere in our bodies. And I spoke a little bit yesterday about how this idea of unshackling the heart has to do with examining the scarring that's built up around our hearts, examining the armor, the shields, the walls, the barriers that we've put up, not because we've necessarily wanted to. Who wants to walk around defensive, anxious, and scared? But more often than not, because that was what we needed to do to survive in whatever situation we found ourselves in. The unfortunate thing is that that survival instinct can often come with us even as we've left whatever situation we were in. That's if we're fortunate enough to be able to leave that situation. And so, this habit perhaps of not caring for ourselves or not thinking that we're worthy of care can follow us even into, say, more mature selves. So, compassion, then, I found, is something that starts to loosen up the heart, starts to heal those wounds, starts to be like anti scar lotion on the heart. Doesn't mean that whatever caused that scarring or those wounds has been resolved, that we've reached into the past, like I said yesterday, and fixed whatever issues we had, but rather it's that energy, that gaze, that attention that we can give to ourselves that just says, it's okay. It's okay that we once were hurt, that we once were misunderstood, not because those things should have happened, but rather they did, they were painful, and they shouldn't have happened. And with compassion, there's this extra step, this extra wish, this extra thought that may I now be free from this pain? May I now be free from this anxiety, this fear, and this tension? And it can often start off as a sort of wishy washy, optimistic, I hope that one day I'll feel better. I hope that one day things will get better. I hope that one day this will heal. But in some ways, this is a useful way to practice faking it till you make it. Faking perhaps feeling compassion for ourselves, feeling kindness for ourselves. Because initially, that feeling may not be there at all. But over time, with this continual showing up for ourselves, it's almost like we start to believe what in the beginning was kind of a lie or kind of not quite true. An image comes to mind of someone who's adopted a dog, let's say, from a shelter, who's been mistreated, who's been abused. And initially, that dog is not very trusting of the new owners. The owners come to the crate, bring it food, and it snarls and snaps and maybe runs into the corner. But day after day, they still come with the food, with kind words, with soft words, with gentleness. And over time, that dog starts to trust the new owner, starts to see that when they say they're going to feed me, they feed me. When they say they're going to be kind to me, they're kind to me. When they say they're going to show up, they show up. And similarly, it's this showing up for ourselves with kindness and with compassion, even if in the beginning it feels untrustworthy, even when it's coming from ourselves, starts to create an opening in the heart, an opening in the mind, where we actually allow ourselves to care for ourselves. This isn't selfish, it's necessary. It's sort of a truism that, in order to love others, we have to love ourselves. Before we can offer something to others, we have to already have this wellspring within ourselves. I don't quite believe that to be true on the surface, but one thing that I think is useful that it's pointing to that may be closer to the truth is that it's easy for us to just get burnt out by constantly offering to others something we don't offer to ourselves, constantly running on empty, martyring ourselves, torturing ourselves, allowing ourselves to be walked all over and mistreated. When we have compassion for ourselves, we don't allow that to happen. And I think, in particular, for queer people and any other people who are marginalized in this world, being able to say, or even just to feel within oneself that I don't deserve this, and this should not happen, and I won't allow it to happen if I can, already offers so much. So much to counteract the messages coming from outside that we don't deserve kindness or safety or love or even basic human dignity. There's an image in the Buddhist text about having your sense doors open, your eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And when they're open, you're like a cow with flayed skin who's just attacked by flies, by mosquitoes, by all sorts of things. And usually that image is in the context of, say, just receiving whatever stimuli that can be pleasant or unpleasant, the sort of mundane things that pop up in daily life, food or advertisements, whatever sensual pleasures are out there. But another way that I think this can be applied, especially in this situation, is all the messaging, all the propaganda, and the ignorance, and the violence and abuse that's lobbed in our direction. And it's no wonder that a lot of that's internalized, especially in our early lives, if we're just bombarded with it day by day, night after night. And having this wellspring inside of metta, of loving kindness and compassion helps just a little bit to counteract that. So it doesn't become a matter of us necessarily needing to close our eyes, close our ears, and shut ourselves away and hide away from the world because it's so cruel. But rather, compassion, metta, and the other Brahma Viharas become a sort of screen. And this screen is different than, say, the wall or the armor, because it's not about ignoring, turning away from, or shutting down, but rather seeing something that's happening and being able to hold that and see what needs to be rejected, what can be accepted, what needs to be put aside, what needs to be let go of. For myself, without sort of this balance of kindness and compassion, then it's just so easy to get tossed over by every wave that comes my way. And of course, this is a daily practice of regenerating, this recuperating and reinvigorating ourselves, which is one reason I think spaces like this are so important, so that we have people around us who we can trust to allow us to heal, to allow us to be fully ourselves without defensiveness, without having to be in attack mode or to have to be ready to fight, ready to defend ourselves, ready to be the person who needs to explain. When we can put those things down for a moment and just take some time to cultivate these qualities, then it's great benefit. And of course, the other side of compassion is the compassion we can offer others. Again, might have to fake it till you make it. Someone mentioned yesterday about difficulties having loving kindness for some really unpleasant people, people who they admitted to hating, really. And oftentimes, if we have these feelings, especially as queer people, of hate or resentment, they're not coming from nothing. Almost all the queer people that I've met in my life want to be loving, want to be kind, want to be compassionate, want to give so much to the world, but are just beaten down. So, of course, there would be resentment, mistrust, anger, ill will towards people that have hurt us, that have said things to harm us, people who are actively trying to deprive us of our rights, people who are actively trying to remove queer people from this planet. How can we have compassion for someone like that? It's a koan in some ways, but I know that the kind of compassion we're offering is not, as one teacher put it, idiot compassion. That is, we're not allowing ourselves to be hurt, thinking that in doing that, we're somehow helping others. We're not throwing ourselves in front of a gun, throwing ourselves under a bus, or staying in abusive situations, because that doesn't actually help anyone. If anything, it just allows people to create more unwholesome actions and results for themselves. So if we can try to remove ourselves from those situations, and this wish for compassion, may this person be free from suffering, is done with a recognition that harming others, abusing others, being violent towards others is harmful for both people involved. They're acting out of ignorance, out of delusion, out of a misguided belief that by harming someone else, they could somehow be happy. And how could someone who's happy hurt someone else? So, this wish for someone who is abusing or harming to be happy, a wish for them to be free from suffering, is a wish for them to stop doing those things that are hurting others. It's a wish for them to put down harmful behavior. It's a wish for them to change, a wish for them to be better. And to the degree that we can actually help that person through actions of body, speech, and mind, then sure, go ahead. But it's always with that discernment of if what we're doing is actually helping, if what we're doing is actually useful, and if we're allowing ourselves to be harmed or not in the process. I think this is really, really important for queer people. And I speak for myself in saying that it's easy to put myself in a situation where I put up with maybe just a little bit more than I should, thinking that I'm doing someone a service by being a martyr. But the truth that I've been coming to realize more and more is I can't do the work for other people. I can't sacrifice myself so that someone else can become just a little more aware, a little more considerate, a little more kind, especially if they didn't ask for my help, especially if they're not receptive to it. Sometimes we might feel guilty for thinking that way, but that guilt is just another form of oppression and of violence. And at least in myself, when I've examined that deeply, it's not a guilt that's coming from within, but it's a guilt still stemming from internalized bigotry, from a belief misguided that the person being oppressed is the one who should not only free themselves and save themselves, but then change the oppressor. In the end, that doesn't really help anyone. But what will change people, what will cause meaningful and lasting reflection is when, if we can, we say, no more. We say, I won't do this anymore because this isn't right. And sometimes this might mean cultivating metta and compassion at a distance. Might mean setting a lot of boundaries for ourselves and for others. But it's only in the context of this sort of emotional and mental and even physical safety that we can begin to heal what's inside. And so I mentioned how compassion can lead to a sort of letting go of the things that we're holding on to. This letting go isn't willed into reality, it's not thought into creation. It's something that happens naturally when we come to understand ourselves and other people. I was recently on a BIPOC retreat in Massachusetts, and at the end of the retreat, this fellow was speaking and saying how on the retreat, having processed certain things from his teenage years, he came to understand how so much of the hurt and abuse he received from his father was his father's misguided attempt to teach him how to survive in this world as a Black man, teach him how to be tough, how to be strong, how to be without emotion, without soft qualities, without kindness. But this realization for him happened not in a moment of anger or resentment, but rather understanding. that these were the conditions his father were dealing with. And for that, he could forgive him, not excuse him. What his father did was wrong, was unwholesome, and shouldn't have happened. But he can forgive that his father wasn't able to be different at that time. And with that forgiveness, there was this inner shift, at least how he explained it, of being able to put down, even just a little bit, the anger and the resentment and the sadness that he was really holding on to. Similarly, I think we can use compassion to try and look at and hold those wounds that we might have and see if by doing that, offering both ourselves and other people a little bit of forgiveness, we can loosen something. But I do reiterate that this is something that has to happen naturally. If there's still a lot of anger and a lot of resentment, then that's just how things are. As I said to one person who shared yesterday, it's not as if practicing loving kindness means we move from pure hatred to pure love in one go. We might move from pure hatred to just a little bit of hatred, to indifference, to not thinking so much about that person, to being like meh, being like maybe I can start to understand them. Maybe I can start to see them being happy. And we allow ourselves to experience that process, which in a lot of ways is really a process of grieving. Grieving the experiences we wish we could have had in the past. Wishing perhaps that we didn't have to suffer so much, that people didn't have to mistreat us and misunderstand us. And so we let that happen in the time and the way that it needs to. But knowing that it is possible to eventually arrive at forgiveness, at the very least for ourselves. It might be weird to think that we might need to be forgiven in, say, a circumstance that we've been the victim of. But I know that for myself, that forgiveness takes the form of forgiving myself for not being able to remove myself from the situation, forgive myself for being vulnerable, forgive myself of thinking that I should have been this, that, or the other thing, that I should have been stronger, that I should have been smarter, that I should have said this or done that. There's a lot of ways, as I like to say, that we can should all over ourselves. But if we can offer ourselves the freedom from shoulding, then there's already so much that that can do to unshackle the heart. So I offer some of these thoughts as a reflection, just to give you something to chew on, to discard if you need to mull over, forget, do whatever you need to with it, but hopefully something there is at least a stepping stone for further practice, further reflection. Thank you for your attention.
Annamayang Dhammakataya Sadhu Karang Dadamase Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu